"I clean floors, not lies," Naomi Carter said, and the words didn't just enter the boardroom. They landed, heavy and precise, like something that had been waiting too long to be spoken. The air conditioning hummed softly above the polished glass table, but no one moved, not the row of executives in tailored suits, not the assistant holding a tablet mid-note, not even Edward Holloway, whose pen hovered exactly 1 inch above a contract worth more than most people in that building would see in a lifetime. Naomi stood just inside the doorway, her janitor cart still behind her, one gloved hand resting lightly on the handle as if she hadn't planned to stop, as if she had almost kept walking. But something in the room, something off, something wrong, had pulled her in and rooted her there. A faint scent of industrial cleaner clung to her uniform, sharp against the expensive cologne that lingered in the room. And for a moment the contrast itself felt louder than her voice. Edward's eyes shifted toward her, slow, measured, not angry yet, but surprised in a way that powerful men rarely allow themselves to be, his silver cufflink catching the overhead light as his wrists stilled in midair. "Excuse me?" someone murmured, not quite loud enough to challenge her, but enough to remind the room of its hierarchy. Naomi didn't flinch, didn't lower her gaze, didn't apologize. She simply stepped forward once, the soft squeak of her rubber sole against the marble floor echoing farther than it should have, and lifted her hand just slightly, not pointing at anyone, but toward the contract itself. "That line," she said quietly, her voice steady, almost calm in a way that didn't match the tension building around her. "The liability clause on page 14. It doesn't protect you, it shifts everything onto you." And this time the silence wasn't just surprise, it was pressure, the kind that presses against your ears and makes you aware of your own breathing. A man near the end of the table let out a short, dismissive laugh, too quick, too sharp, like he needed to break something before it broke him, while another leaned forward, flipping pages faster than necessary, the thin paper whispering under his fingers. Edward didn't laugh, he didn't speak. He just lowered the pen slowly until it touched the paper without signing, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as his eyes dropped to the document in front of him. Naomi stood still, her shoulders relaxed but her spine straight, as if she had already accepted whatever would come next, as if being heard wasn't the point, only saying it was. "Security," a voice said from somewhere behind her, controlled but edged with irritation, and she could feel the shift immediately, the room reclaiming itself, pushing her back into the role it had assigned her the moment she walked in. But she didn't move yet, not until Edward's gaze flicked up again, meeting hers for a fraction of a second, long enough for something unspoken to pass between them, something that wasn't agreement, not yet, but wasn't dismissal either. Then, without a word, he turned back to the page, and the entire room seemed to lean in with him, as if the truth Naomi had placed on the table had weight, and no one could ignore it anymore. The door closed behind Naomi with a soft click that felt louder than anything she had said inside, the sound sealing her back into the quiet world she belonged to, where footsteps echoed in empty hallways and conversations never reached above a whisper. She did not rush, did not look back, just guided the janitor cart forward, the wheels rolling smoothly over the marble floor that reflected the ceiling lights like a second, colder sky beneath her feet. And for a moment her hands trembled slightly against the handle before she steadied them, tightening her grip until the motion disappeared. She had crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed, not by someone wearing her uniform, not by someone whose name was not printed on the frosted glass door she had just walked past. And she knew exactly what that meant, because she had seen it before in smaller rooms, in quieter ways, where people like her were expected to notice everything and say nothing. Behind the closed doors, voices began to rise, muffled at first, then sharper, like something fragile had cracked open and could not be put back together. And Naomi paused just long enough to hear the shift in tone, not the words themselves, but the urgency, the loss of control, the kind that did not happen in rooms built on certainty. She exhaled slowly, her breath fogging faintly against the polished chrome of the cart, and for a second she closed her eyes, not in regret, but in acknowledgement of what she had done, because she had not spoken out of impulse. She had spoken out of recognition, the same quiet recognition that had followed her for years, from late nights at a kitchen table covered in borrowed textbooks to early mornings spent scanning documents left behind by people who never imagined someone like her would understand them. A memory flickered through her mind, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, her father's voice years ago, telling her that truth did not need permission, that it only needed courage, and she had carried that with her long after everything else had been taken or left behind. The hallway stretched ahead, long and silent, but it did not feel empty. It felt suspended, like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to resolve, and Naomi kept moving, one step after another, the rhythm grounding her, the familiar motion of work returning her to something she could control, even as she knew the moment inside that room was still unfolding without her. She reached the corner where the light shifted slightly, warmer near the windows that overlooked the city 30 floors below, cars moving like distant lines of light, lives continuing unaware of what had almost happened above them. And she stopped there for just a second, resting both hands on the cart, her shoulders rising and falling once, steady, measured. She did not wonder if she had done the right thing. That question had already been answered the moment she chose to speak. Instead, she wondered how long it would take for them to see it, to move past disbelief and pride and into something quieter, something closer to truth. And as if in response, the door behind her opened again, not fully, just enough for a voice to cut through the hallway, sharper now, less controlled, calling for the legal team, for a review, for a pause. And Naomi did not turn immediately. She let the sound reach her, let it settle, before slowly lifting her head, her expression unchanged, calm, grounded, as the weight of the room she had left behind finally began to shift without her presence. And somewhere deep inside that space of glass and steel and power, the narrative she had interrupted was beginning to unravel line by line inside the boardroom. The silence did not return to normal. It deepened, shifting into something heavier, more deliberate, as pages turned with less confidence and more urgency, the soft rustle of paper now carrying weight instead of routine. Edward Holloway leaned forward slightly, his posture no longer relaxed but focused, his fingers pressing flat against the contract as if trying to hold it still, while his mind caught up with what had just been said. And across from him, Martin Voss adjusted his tie, with a small, controlled motion that did not quite hide the tightening in his jaw. "It is standard language," Martin said, his voice smooth but just a fraction too quick, the kind of reassurance that arrives before the question has even been fully asked, and that alone made the room shift again, subtle but undeniable. The company lawyer, a man who had spent 20 years reading contracts line by line, did not respond immediately. He simply flipped to page 14, then back, then forward again. Slower this time, his finger tracing the paragraph as if he were seeing it for the first time. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than expected. "This clause, it is not standard." And that was the moment the air changed completely. Edward's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation, the kind that builds silently behind stillness. And he reached for a second copy of the document, scanning it himself now, no longer relying on the room to interpret it for him, each line pulling tighter as he moved through it, each word rearranging what he thought he understood just minutes earlier. Martin let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but it did not carry. It fell short, landing awkwardly between confidence and concern. "You are overanalyzing," he said, leaning back slightly, attempting to reclaim space. But no one followed his lead. No one echoed the ease he was trying to project. Claire Holloway shifted in her chair, her gaze moving from Edward to the lawyer, then briefly toward the door Naomi had exited through, as if the presence she had dismissed so easily had not fully left the room, as if it lingered in the silence between every word. Edward turned another page, then stopped, his finger resting on a single sentence, and for a moment he did not speak, did not look up, he just read it. Again, slower, deeper, and the room waited, every movement reduced to breath and stillness, until finally he set the document down, not abruptly, not dramatically, just carefully, like something that had become heavier than expected. "Explain this," he said, his voice low, directed not at the room, but at Martin. And this time there was no confusion about who held the authority in that question. Martin leaned forward, his expression composed, but the edges were beginning to show, small fractures in the certainty he had carried in with him. "It is a risk distribution mechanism," he replied, choosing his words with precision. But the lawyer shook his head slightly before he could continue. "It is a full liability transfer," and the distinction settled into the room like a verdict. Edward's hand moved away from the pen completely now, resting flat against the table, and his gaze lifted, not toward Martin, but toward the door, the same door Naomi had walked through minutes ago. And for the first time since she spoke, the room followed his eyes, the weight of recognition moving quietly from one person to the next, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, because the truth had already been placed in front of them, and now it was unfolding on its own terms. The request for explanation did not dissolve the tension, it tightened it, pulling every eye toward Martin Voss as if the entire room had shifted its gravity to him alone, and for a moment he held that attention with practiced composure, shoulders squared, voice measured. But there was something beneath it now, something less certain, like a note slightly off in an otherwise perfect performance. "It reallocates exposure," he said, choosing each word carefully, but Edward did not respond immediately. He just watched him, the silence stretching longer than comfort allowed, long enough for the edges of confidence to begin to fray. The lawyer leaned forward again, tapping the page lightly with a pen, not aggressively, but with precision. "It reallocates all exposure," he clarified, his tone still calm, but firmer now, and that single word settled into the room like weight added to a scale. Claire shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the armrest, her earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something closer to concern, and she glanced again toward the door, as if trying to reconcile the image of the woman who had spoken with the reality unfolding in front of them. Edward finally moved, not abruptly, but with intent, sliding the contract an inch away from him, creating a small but unmistakable distance between himself and the decision he had nearly made. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, steadier, stripped of the performative authority he had carried at the start of the meeting. "Why was this not disclosed clearly?" he asked, not raising his volume, not needing to, because the room was already listening more closely than it had before. Martin exhaled through his nose, a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but enough to reveal the pressure building beneath his control. "It is embedded in the structure," he replied, "standard in complex agreements." But even as he said it, the words lacked the certainty they were meant to carry. The lawyer shook his head once, slow and deliberate. "It is concealed in the structure," he corrected, and that distinction did not just change the sentence. It changed the room, the meaning, the intent, everything narrowing into a single point of clarity that could no longer be ignored. Edward's gaze did not leave Martin now, his eyes steady, assessing, recalibrating, and the power dynamic that had seemed fixed only minutes ago began to shift in a way that did not require raised voices or dramatic gestures, only recognition. Around the table, executives who had remained silent began to lean forward, not to speak, but to see, to understand, to confirm for themselves what had just been uncovered, their earlier detachment replaced by a quiet urgency. The assistant who had been typing notes paused completely, her screen reflecting the overhead lights as her hands hovered above the keyboard, waiting for something definitive to anchor the moment. Edward reached for the document again, but this time he did not pick up the pen. He turned another page, then another, as if searching for anything else that might have been missed, anything that might confirm whether this was an isolated issue or part of something larger. And with each movement, the room followed him, breath by breath, page by page. Finally, he stopped, his hand resting flat against the paper, and for a brief moment he closed his eyes, not in frustration, but in calculation, assembling the pieces in silence. And when he opened them again, there was a shift, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that comes when uncertainty gives way to understanding. He leaned back slightly, not retreating, but repositioning, and his gaze moved once more toward the door, the same door that had closed behind Naomi. And this time it was not curiosity that followed, it was recognition, quiet and undeniable, as the truth she had carried into the room continued to unfold without her, line by line, leaving no space for it to be dismissed again. The room did not erupt, it compressed, every voice pulling inward instead of rising. as if the truth had narrowed the space between them. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one seemed eager to speak first. Edward Holloway remained still, his fingers resting flat against the table. But there was tension now in the stillness, a recalibration happening behind his eyes as he measured not just the document, but the people around it, the assumptions he had made, the trust he had extended without question. Across from him, Martin Voss adjusted. His posture again, straighter this time, more deliberate, as if control could be restored through precision. "We can revise the language," he said, his tone carefully neutral. But the offer came too quickly, like a step backward disguised as flexibility, and it did not go unnoticed. The lawyer closed the contract halfway. Not fully, just enough to signal pause, not conclusion. "This is not a revision issue," he said quietly. "This is an intent issue." And the word intent lingered in the air, longer than any technical term had, because it did not belong to paperwork, it belonged to judgment. Claire's gaze dropped briefly to the table, then lifted again, but this time it did not carry the same certainty. There was something unsettled in it now, something that had not been there before, and she pressed her lips together as if holding back a question she was not ready to ask out loud. Edward finally leaned back in his chair, the leather creasing softly beneath him, his movement slow, controlled, but unmistakably final in one respect. He was no longer considering the deal as presented. That possibility had already slipped away, and the room felt it without needing confirmation. "How many others?" he asked, his voice even, directed not at Martin alone, but at the situation itself, at the pattern he was beginning to see, and for a fraction of a second, Martin did not answer, not because he did not hear, but because the question reached further than he expected. The pause was brief, but it was enough for the silence to sharpen again, enough for every person at the table to register it, to feel the shift from negotiation to scrutiny. "This structure is common," Martin replied finally, but the words did not carry the same weight they had earlier. They felt thinner now, stretched, and the lawyer's expression did not change as he responded, "Not like this." And that was all it took to draw a line that could not be blurred again. Edward's gaze moved slowly across the table, taking in each face, each reaction, the subtle changes in posture, the avoidance of eye contact, the quiet recognition that something fundamental had shifted, and when his eyes reached the empty space near the door, the absence there felt present, as if the person who had spoken earlier had left something behind that continued to influence the room. He exhaled once, steady, controlled, then leaned forward again, but this time not toward the contract, toward the people, toward the truth that had surfaced whether they were ready or not. "We are done here," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, and no one argued, no one attempted to redirect, because the decision had already been made in the silence before the words. Chairs shifted slightly as people adjusted, not rising yet, not breaking the moment, but preparing for its end. And as the contract lay untouched in the center of the table, its pages no longer carrying promise but consequence, the weight of what had nearly happened settled fully into the room, quiet and undeniable, while beyond the glass walls, the city continued its motion, unaware that inside, a single voice from outside their world had changed the course of everything. The boardroom emptied slowly, not with the usual low hum of casual conversation or the shuffle of satisfied agreement, but with a quiet that lingered, as if no one wanted to be the first to break what had just settled over them. And Edward Holloway remained seated long after the others had stood, his eyes fixed on the contract still resting untouched in front of him, its pages no longer symbols of opportunity, but reminders of how close he had come to something else entirely. Outside in the hallway, Naomi Carter moved with the same steady rhythm she always had, guiding the mop across the floor in smooth, practiced arcs, the faint scent of clean solution trailing behind her like a quiet signature. And for anyone passing by, nothing about her would seem different. No sign that she had just shifted the course of a multi-million-dollar decision with a single sentence. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows at the end of the corridor, casting long reflections across the polished surface beneath her feet, and she paused for a moment to rinse the mop, the water swirling softly in the bucket. catching fragments of light that flickered and disappeared as quickly as they formed. Her hands moved automatically, muscle memory guiding each motion. But her mind was still, not replaying the scene, not questioning it, just holding the calm that came from knowing she had done what she believed was right. Regardless of what followed, back inside the boardroom, Edward finally stood, the chair sliding back with a quiet sound that echoed more than expected in the now empty space. And he walked to the window, looking out over the city that stretched in every direction, buildings rising and falling like waves of steel and glass, each one holding decisions, risks, and consequences of its own. He rested one hand against the glass, cool and solid beneath his palm, and for a moment he said nothing, not even to himself, just stood there, letting the silence settle into something he could understand. The memory of Naomi's voice returned, not loud, not insistent, but clear, precise, impossible to ignore now that he had seen what she had seen, and it did not sit with him as an interruption anymore. It sat as a correction, a moment that had redirected something he had almost overlooked. In the hallway, Naomi finished one section of the floor and moved to the next, the wheels of her cart turning softly, each rotation steady, consistent, as if time itself had resumed its usual pace around her. And yet there was a subtle difference, something unspoken in the way a few employees glanced at her as they passed, a flicker of recognition that had not been there before, quickly masked, quickly dismissed, but present nonetheless. She did not meet their eyes, did not seek acknowledgement. She simply continued, her focus returning to the work in front of her, the small, tangible task that she could complete one square foot at a time, unlike the larger, unseen shifts that had begun elsewhere. Edward turned from the window and looked once more at the table, at the empty chairs, at the place where Naomi had stood just inside the door, and for the first time that day, he felt the weight of something beyond the contract, something quieter, more personal, not about the deal he had stopped, but about the person he had almost ignored, and he took a slow breath, steadying himself, as the silence in the room settled into something final, not an ending, but a pause before whatever came next. The building did not return to normal, not entirely, even as the hours moved forward and meetings resumed behind closed doors, because something subtle had shifted in the space between people, something that could not be undone simply by continuing as if nothing had happened, and Edward Holloway felt it in every step he took as he left the boardroom, the quiet following him down the corridor like an echo that had not decided to fade. He walked past glass offices where conversations paused just a fraction too long when he appeared, past assistants who straightened their posture without quite knowing why, and he did not acknowledge any of it. His focus fixed ahead, not on where he was going, but on who he was looking for. Further down the hallway, Naomi Carter was finishing another section of the floor, the mop gliding in steady, even strokes, her movements controlled, almost meditative, as if each pass erased not just footprints but noise, leaving behind something cleaner, quieter, more certain. She did not notice him at first, or perhaps she did and chose not to react. Her gaze lowered slightly, focused on the reflection forming beneath her hands, where the overhead lights stretched into long, pale lines across the polished surface. Edward slowed as he approached, not out of hesitation, but out of something unfamiliar, something closer to awareness. And for a moment he simply watched, taking in the contrast between the precision of her work and the simplicity of her role, the way she occupied the space without demanding it, without expecting to be seen. The wheels of her cart clicked softly as she shifted position, and that sound, small and ordinary, grounded the moment more than anything else could have. Naomi, he said finally, her name deliberate, clear, and it carried differently than it would have earlier, not as a command, not as a dismissal, but as recognition. She paused, just slightly, then straightened, turning toward him with the same calm expression she had held in the doorway of the boardroom, her eyes steady, not guarded, not defiant, simply present. For a second, neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with everything that had already happened, everything that did not need to be repeated, and Edward felt the weight of it settle, not as pressure, but as clarity. You were right, he said. The words simple, unembellished, but they did not come easily. They carried the effort of being chosen, of being said in a place where they had not been expected. Naomi did not react immediately, did not soften, did not shift her stance. She simply held his gaze, as if measuring the truth of what he had just said, and then she nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, not accepting praise, not seeking validation, just acknowledging the fact itself. Edward glanced briefly at the floor, at the clean surface reflecting both of them in quiet symmetry, and when he looked back up, something in his posture had changed, less rigid, less certain of its own authority, more aware of the space it occupied. "We stopped the deal," he added, not as a justification, not as an explanation, but as a continuation of the truth she had set in motion. And this time, Naomi's eyes shifted slightly, not with surprise, but with understanding, as if the outcome had always been secondary to the act itself. She rested her hands lightly on the handle of the cart, her grip relaxed, and after a moment she spoke, her voice as steady as before. "Then it was worth saying." And there was no emphasis, no weight placed on the words, just a quiet certainty that settled into the space between them. Edward did not respond right away, because there was nothing immediate to add, nothing that would match the simplicity of what she had said, and as the silence returned, it felt different now, not heavy, not tense, but open, as if something had been cleared that could not be undone. And in that moment, standing in a hallway that smelled faintly of clean water and polished stone, the distance between who they were supposed to be and who they had become shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be seen. Edward did not walk away immediately after her words settled. He remained there for a moment longer, as if something in him needed to adjust to the quiet truth she had just spoken. And for the first time that day, the weight he carried was not tied to numbers or contracts, but to something far less tangible and far more difficult to ignore. Naomi turned back to her work without ceremony, lowering the mop into the bucket and pressing it against the wringer with a steady motion, the soft drip of water returning to its familiar rhythm. And in that simple act there was a kind of resolution that did not require acknowledgement, as if the moment had already completed itself without needing to be extended. Edward watched her for a second, then nodded once, not to her, but to himself, a quiet acceptance that what had happened could not be undone and did not need to be. And as he stepped back, the distance between them returned, but it did not feel the same as before. It was no longer defined by status alone. The hallway remained still, but not empty. There was movement now in the edges, in the glances that passed quickly between employees who had witnessed just enough to understand that something unusual had taken place, though no one spoke of it. Not openly. Not yet, because moments like that rarely announced themselves. They spread quietly, carried in fragments, in looks, in the way people adjusted their tone without realizing why. Naomi guided the mop forward again, the water leaving behind a thin reflective sheen that caught the overhead lights, and as she moved, her reflection shifted beneath her feet, steady and unbroken, a quiet mirror of her own composure. Further down the hall, Claire Holloway appeared, her steps slower than usual, her posture more reserved, and when her eyes met Naomi's for a brief second, there was no dismissal in them this time, no quick turning away, just a pause, subtle but real, as if something in her understanding had been recalibrated. Even if she was not ready to name it, she continued walking. But the silence she left behind felt different, less certain, more aware. Edward turned and began to walk back toward his office, his pace measured, his thoughts no longer racing ahead to the next deal, the next negotiation, but circling something quieter, something that did not fit neatly into the structure he had relied on for years. And as he reached the glass doors, he hesitated briefly, his hand resting against the handle, before pushing it open. Inside, the office was exactly as he had left it, clean lines, controlled light, everything in its place, and yet it felt altered, not in appearance, but in perception, as if the clarity he had always associated with control had shifted into something else, something that required him to look more closely, to question what he had once accepted without pause. He set the contract down on his desk, not with frustration, not with relief, but with intention, and stood there for a moment, looking at it, seeing it now not as an opportunity lost, but as a mistake avoided, a decision redirected by someone who had nothing to gain from speaking and everything to risk by doing so. Back in the hallway, Naomi finished another section of the floor and paused briefly, resting her hands on the cart, her breathing even, her posture unchanged, and for a moment she looked out through the tall windows at the city beyond. The sunlight stretching across buildings and streets that moved on without knowledge of what had shifted above them, and she did not smile, did not reflect on what had happened as something extraordinary. She simply stood there, grounded, present, as the quiet consequence of her choice settled into the world around her. Unseen but undeniable, the day did not end with applause or announcements, or any visible marker that something meaningful had taken place. It ended the way most days did in that building, with lights dimming one row at a time and footsteps thinning out into the quiet rhythm of people returning to their own lives. And yet beneath that routine, something had shifted in a way that did not need to be named to exist. Naomi Carter moved through the final stretch of the hallway with the same steady pace she had carried all day, guiding the mop in smooth, even lines, the faint sound of water against polished stone echoing softly in the near empty space. And as she finished the last section, she lifted the mop, letting the excess water fall back into the bucket in slow, measured drops, each one catching a fragment of the overhead light before disappearing. She straightened, resting both hands on the handle of the cart, and for a moment she stood still, not out of fatigue, but out of completion, the quiet satisfaction of a task done fully, without recognition, without interruption. Down the corridor, the glass walls of the boardroom reflected the empty chairs inside, their arrangement unchanged, but their meaning altered, the table now holding nothing but space where a decision had almost been made and then undone, and in that reflection, the absence of movement felt more significant than any action that had taken place earlier. Edward Holloway stood alone in his office, the contract still resting on his desk, untouched since he had placed it there, and the city beyond his window had begun to glow. With the early lights of evening, small points of brightness scattered across the skyline, each one steady, independent, and he found himself looking not at the height of the buildings, but at the spaces between them, the places where light met shadow, where clarity required attention rather than assumption. He moved closer to the desk and placed his hand lightly on the edge of the document, not to reopen it, not to reconsider it, but simply to acknowledge it, to recognize what it had represented and what it no longer would. And then he let his hand fall away, the decision already settled, not in the boardroom, but within himself. Back in the hallway, Naomi turned the cart toward the service elevator, the wheels rolling quietly as she moved forward, and as she passed the glass wall of the boardroom, her reflection appeared briefly beside the empty chairs, her figure steady, centered, framed by the space that had once excluded her, and for a second, the image held, not as a statement, not as a victory, but as a quiet alignment between where she stood and what she had done. She did not pause, did not look directly at it. She simply continued walking, the reflection slipping away as naturally as it had formed, and the hallway returned to stillness behind her. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and she stepped inside, guiding the cart with practiced ease, turning it just enough to fit within the space. And as the doors began to close, the last thing visible from the hallway was the faint sheen of the floor she had just finished, smooth, uninterrupted, carrying no trace of what had happened there, and yet holding it all the same. Upstairs, Edward remained by the window, the city lights growing brighter against the darkening sky, and in the quiet of his office, with no voices to guide him, no expectations to meet, he stood in a silence that no longer felt empty, but clear, as if something essential had been revealed not through force, not through power, but through a single moment of truth spoken without permission. And in that stillness, the distance between who had spoken and who had listened no longer felt fixed, only understood.